After waiting a full 7 days for the concrete to cure, we went ahead and started removing the plastic and the wooden forms from the concrete. Plastic was easy to remove, and actually the tops of the forms weren't too bad. This whole process I was a little bit worried about since, during the pour we'd heard some kind of snapping and popping, and we saw some movement of the forms, so they were definitely under strain and pressure during the pour, and they'd shifted a little bit. And so I wasn't sure how well they would come off. But the top part of the wooden part on the top that's kind of above ground, that came off pretty easily. It wasn't too bad. It was the OSB that actually goes down inside the trench and forms the walls for the inside of the trench that ended up being problematic. I could tell right away that, when the concrete was poured in there, it just kind of pushed those OSB boards up against the side of the trench really tight. So it was just smashed really hard against the dirt walls of the trench. And I didn't figure there was any way I was going to get them out of there. I tried, pulling on them a little bit. They were not budging. I tried a few things, and it looked like, the only way to get them out was going to be to, excavate a trench all the way down to the 2-foot depth, 2-foot or deeper depth, all the way around the outside and the inside in order to remove these boards. And I just wasn't willing to put in that amount of work. So I was about ready to just cut excavate down about a foot or so and cut a little bit of off the top so that it wasn't visible, and then kind of backfill up to and just leave some of that OSB in the trench permanently. Of course, that's not a good solution. I know it'll decay and then eventually leave a gap there, and could be a problem with bugs and different things. I didn't want to do that, but I just didn't think there was a workable solution. Fortunately, April was out there helping me, and she is not one to give up easy, and so she just started trying different things and working at it, and I had already completely given up on getting those OSB boards out of the ground, and she actually started to get them loose. And so what she was doing was she was digging down, it was kind of as far as she could without going crazy with it, and then pouring water in the bottom of the trench, and then working the board kind of back and forth with a pry bar, trying to get it loose. And then we were actually able to get a board out, and then two, and then we decided, well, we've got this far, we might as well keep going and get them all out, because that's the right way to do it. So we ended up spending that whole day and then part of the next morning removing all the boards, out of the, away from the footer. And so looking back on it, it was a little bit of work, but I'm glad, April persisted and convinced me to persist, and I'm glad we got them out of there, because it's just the right way to do the job. And then we were able to go back and backfill properly and compact, and don't have to worry about there being problems in the future. When April and I started this project, our intention was to do as much of the work as we could ourselves as possible, and really try not to hire any of the work out, just do it all of ourselves. Fortunately, the permitting in our county allows us to do that, and so we wanted to take full advantage of that and just build the house from scratch ourselves. And so this included the foundation and all the concrete work. I'd never done a full foundation for a house. I'd never poured footers, but it always looked, fairly easy, seen some videos of people doing it and learned a few things and thought, well, I can do that. And sure enough, we were able to do it. It wasn't horrible, but it was more work than I expected. We kind of went back through and calculated the amount of time that we spent working on this foundation so far. So we had to build up the pad, first of all with a backhoe, and then dig out the trenches for the footers, and then pour the footers, and then of course start laying all the utilities. And so far I think we have about a month into it, which, that's not too bad as far as time, but it feels like it's been a long month of work days, and just kind of a lot more, I guess, more work and heartache than I would have expected. So it's not easy work pouring your own foundation and doing all this yourself, but it's been a great experience. I'm glad we did it. I'm glad we're doing it all ourselves. I wouldn't have it any other way, but I just gotta kind of be honest and say it was definitely more than I expected. It's definitely a lot of work to do your own foundation. After a long and kind of hard day of digging and removing forms, we were just about finished that night. We got some rain. The next morning we got back at it and removed the rest of the forms, and then we started backfilling. And I had kind of kept piles of dirt all along and around the foundation to use for the backfill. And so we just did it all by hand. We just both got shovels and backfilled everything and compacted as we went. And then I also, graded the slope away from the foundation while we were at it and kind of spread all the dirt out. And so it's ready to go. It's kind of in its permanent form. Of course, later on we'll want to plant some kind of a vegetation or something to hold it in place. I'd like to give you a little bit of information about the cost of this foundation so far. Our situation is a little unique in that we don't have to buy permits. We don't have to have an engineer make up drawings. I designed the foundation myself, and so we'd had zero cost in permits and in drawings or anything like that. So our cost was just in the cost of concrete, which was about $1,500 per pour, 2 pours. And the cost of wood for the forms, which was ridiculous. We bought a lot of it during the time wood was so expensive. And so that was actually a little over $1,800 just for the wood for the forms. And we actually reused them. We reused the same forms that we used on the first pour on the second pour. So it would have been way more expensive if we hadn't done it that way. But anyway, and then the last part of the expense that we would count on this is the backhoe expense of renting the backhoe so that we could build up the pad, which I did myself, and then dig the trenches with the backhoe. And so we actually counted half of the total backhoe rental for the pad work that I did and counted the other half towards the septic system. Anyway, all that comes out to a grand total of about $7,000 is what we have into it so far. We never got a quote on having this done since we just planned to do it all ourselves, so I don't know how much it would cost to have this professionally done. But that's how much it cost us. The backfill on the outside and the inside right next to the footer is complete. Once we finished with the backfill, I got back to the working on the utilities. So the electric first and then the water. But I would like to explain a little bit how I have the pad set up right now. So right now the level inside the perimeter of the footer, so the inside of the pad, is roughly 8 inches below the top of the footer, which will be the top of the floor. So the top of the footer will be the same height as the top of the floor. And there's a step that I put in, a basically 4-inch by 4-inch step on the inside of the footer all the way around that delineates, or that kind of marks the level of the aircrete that we'll pour. So the aircrete will be about 4 inches deep, and then below that will be some kind of a sublayer. And below that will be earth. And so the earth is already 8 inches below and kind of at the right level. So earlier I had went through the pad and dug shallow trenches, about 4 inches deep to put in the utilities. And so the bottom of that utility trench is about 12 inches from the top of the pad. And so I have room to put in the utilities in those shallow trenches and kind of bury and bed those, and then still have 8 inches to work with for the actual pad and subfloor itself. We still had a few more runs of conduit that we need to do, so I'm working on those here. This is a big run of conduit that's actually going to come up underneath the kind of kitchen sink area and provide power to the stove and various things in that part of the house. But so there was a couple of those that we did that we were working on, and then I started marking out the location of some floor outlets that we're going to put in. We wanted 3 floor outlets in our living room, and so once I finished up the conduit here, got it all put together, I started measuring out and working on those floor outlets. Once I finished running the electrical conduit, I moved on to the water lines. So we're using PEX in this house, and I'm using a combination of 3/4 inch and 1/2 inch PEX. All the local stuff on the side of the house where I'm bringing the water in will be 1/2 inch, and then I'm running a couple 3/4 inch lines over to the other side of the house where the other bathroom is. And then I'll have another kind of sub panel there where I'll branch off with 1/2 inch and take it actually to the service points. I'm running 3/4 and 1/2 inch PEX lines, white, blue, and red. Of course, red for the hot and blue for the cold. And then I'll come back in later and insulate the red PEX lines, which will be the hot, so that they don't lose heat as the water's traveling across the house underground. And then we'll bed and bury. As you can see, it's pretty difficult to get the PEX line to stay where you want it to go. It wants to curl back up, and it has a memory. And so ended up filling a bunch of sandbags. That April helped me do that, and then we laid sandbags out all along to keep it where I wanted it in the trench until we did our burying. We decided to go with PEX line because it's a long-lasting material, it's inexpensive, and I decided I wanted to run full runs to every location from a kind of divider header or a kind of a service station because I didn't want any connections underground. So through this house there will be no underground like unions. It'll be all solid runs of one piece of pipe from this header that you see here all the way to each service location. I took a little break from running water lines to finish up the septic and the gray water runs for the guest bathroom. So I had to run those to the location where they need to be permanently and stub them up. Of course, we have the white pipe is going to be, serving, go to the sewer, and that'll be to the toilet. And then the gray water will be going to the sink and the shower. So those will both be exclusively gray water, and we'll go into that system. After finishing up those septic connections, I bedded and buried those lines, and then I was ready to get back to working on the water. I'd like to mention a little bit this water distribution panel that I made. So it's this OSB panel that's sticking up, and I was able to screw in little tabs that hold all of my water lines in place on this panel, and it's so nice. So basically I built 2 distribution headers, one for hot water and one for cold water. So there's 2 headers at the top with lines coming out the bottom. Each line has its own valve, and it's all just really nicely laid out where you can see where everything's going. I'll come back in here and label all these lines individually later. One will be kitchen sink hot, kitchen sink cold. And so from this distribution panel, I'll be able to close the valve to any water line in this side of the house. I'm actually going to make another distribution panel like this for the master bathroom that connects to those 2 3/4 inch PEX lines that I ran to that side of the house. So this distribution panel will serve the guest bath and the kitchen area. But anyway, each line comes into this panel and heads out individually, and I just really like the design. It's really simple and easy to use later on. I left some, plenty of extra material for a pigtail sticking up where the water line is going to be coming up through the pad. Got an extra 2 or 3 feet there, and I put tape over the ends of the line so bugs and stuff didn't crawl in them. And then also April will be coming in the next day or two to wrap those lines in plastic to provide UV protection for those stub up lines so they don't get degraded in the sun while we're working on the rest of the project. The last thing we're doing here is just adding that insulation to the hot water lines to, insulate the pipe so that we don't lose heat from the hot water heater as it's traveling to the service location. And we did that. Just really easy to do using the insulated tubing. Also use some of that insulated tubing in other areas to provide a cushion where 2 lines crossed each other. So I used it in a few other locations as well. But we're putting that on here and getting ready to wrap up. The next thing will be to bed and bury all of these exposed lines. So bed with sand that April was able to harvest from somewhere else in the property. And then we're going to cover that with dirt, and hopefully by the time we do all of that, it'll all be nice and covered, kind of locked permanently in place, and we'll have kind of a fairly uniform 8-inch depth all the way across the pad that we can build the layers that we'll need to build to, create the final pad.